I really, really like the theme of the conference because I believe that development is not something that you give to people; it's something that people give to themselves. So it's really critical to understand, individuals, families, and ethnic groups, and their contribution, to their own development. It's a huge project, and this is a second paper that's based on this. The picture you have is a picture of my uncle, who went to the missionary school in Benin in 1909. He was the second one in the village who had been to school, but he was hugely influential. So basically, he started a movement, I should say, or he inspired a movement of PhD mothers in my home village. What I'm saying this because my village has, 350 people and has 13 PhDs. And the reason simply because of stories like him and the presence of education opportunities for people. And what I'm going to talk about, you'll see the mechanism. You'll see how this kind of miracle, these clusters of excellence, which also part of the African story, which is not told enough, why it happens. So, the paper is going to be about the way education affects intergenerational mobility. And intergenerational mobility basically captures the likelihood that parents are doing better or worse than their kids. And obviously, it depends on innate ability of individuals, but also depends on social environments. And unfortunately, social mobility has not been debated enough in development economics. But it's a huge literature in sociology focusing on the US and in Europe, but not enough in the context of Africa. And it's very unfortunate because not only it focuses on families, but also it provides a good narrative for development because, development is when we are better off than our parents and our kids are better off than us, And this is something that you can measure, you can capture at an individual level. So this is very, very critical. And what is interesting is that, debates about social mobility help you to understand, not only the effect of public policy, but also the effects of personal or family choices, choices made within the family that might have, similar effect. So, this paper contributes to not only the effect of education on colonial development, because the school I'm going to talk about were set up in, late 19th century and early 20th century, but also it's a contribution to the debate on social mobility in the US, because as I said, most of the literature is about social mobility, and then the role of education plays is something that sometimes is not captured at micro level, the project captures something unique about colonial schools because in many contexts, they were set up at a time where there had been little European influence. So as a result, individuals who had been to school went to school more or less by chance, especially the first two cohorts. So you cannot talk about self-selection per se. And second, what is interesting about colonial school is that it triggered an important, it's an important shock, income shock, because in many contexts, you have 90, 95, even 99% of subsistence farmers. And then when the school came, it created immediate and huge inequality between individuals, those who have been to school and those who have not. So it's an important moment in the history of many African families. So being able to go back in time to see how it happened and document this across generation is something which not only is interesting in all right, but also it helps, as I mentioned earlier, to measure and to capture, for instance, not only the effect of education mobility in general, but to understand how African societies have changed since those days as a result of the introduction of formal education. So what we find is that we find three, maybe actually four results. The first one is that, as I mentioned earlier, you have big difference between those who have been to school and those who did not. And as I said earlier, those been to school, they went to school more or less by chance. Yeah, I'm not going to go through the details in how this happened. Second, the second result is that you have a huge decrease in inequality between families in the second generation, especially among the families living near a school. So, first generation, you have big gap between those educated and those who did not. But second generation, you see a leveling effect because those who have been to school inspired those who have not been to send their kids to school, and as a result, you see a leveling effect. You see a huge catch-up, I should say, of those who were living near a school with someone in the village who have been to school. You know, as I'll mention earlier, it's a big story of aspiration, how aspiration, in fact, can have big effect on education. The third one, which is the third important result, is that we saw a decline in mobility from the second to the third generation. And what is interesting is that you have, like many, especially among the families who were educated, and you have still the poor catching up, many of them placing their kids in the upper class, but then you have those from the upper class who went down drastically. And this is very interesting, because it's an unique, I should say, nearly unique feature of African societies that's not debated well enough. And one of the reasons for this, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, is that educated families, first of all, have on average more kids than uneducated families. And second, you have the so-called family tax. You have huge transfer from the educated to their family members, which helps increase, which has reduced inequality. At the same time, it was a drag for those families who initially were educated. So you have two dynamics at play, one in which you have a lot of externalities, a lot of transfer, a reduction of inequality, but at the same time, you have the originally wealthy people who actually went down. And something I hope I have time to talk about, which is very interesting, is that we find that social mobility itself has positive effect on preferences for risk, risk preference, for self-reliance, and on mental health. So because usually when you talk about social mobility, we just describe it, we just see what is the determinant of social mobility. We don't necessarily look at what the effect this has. And this is very, very important. So when mobility decline or downward mobility, for instance, can be very detrimental to your health and to the health of your kids. And this is something that we find in the data. And then another important result that maybe I hope I have time to talk about is the fact that we did an exercise. So for instance, when people talk about poverty, it's about, there is a big literature on poverty and self-control, meaning that the poor, for instance, they have so many issues to deal with that they lack self-control. They are not optimistic, they are pessimistic. I find in the data that this pessimism, in fact, depends not on where you are, but also where you come from. So, for instance, if your parents are rich and you are down, you are more likely to be pessimistic than your parents were poor and you are moving up. So you might have someone who has higher income, but is far more pessimistic than somebody whose income is lower because of the effect of social mobility. And this finding, for instance, can have an extremely important, can be an interesting contribution to the issue, to the debate on social mobility and mental health in the U.S. For instance, Andrew Deaton have shown recently that one of the epidemics in the U.S. is not about, it's mostly about, alcoholism, depression, and so on. And most of the time, middle-class individuals are affected. And the reason could be lack of mobility, could be the reason why this happened. Now, I'm not going to go through the details, but it was a massive, very ambitious data collection effort. So first, we have to select the site where we are going to do the study. So we selected places that are 100 kilometers from the coast because they have very limited European influence. You cannot say that people been to school because they were exposed to European influence prior to the school being created. So that's one. So we selected 4 sites. My own village being one of them. The second, to have experienced the creation of Colonial School was in 1895, and then we selected, school in other places of the country. Kandy is a Muslim-dominated area. Save is central and more commercial kind of town, and Natitengu is northwest, which is more mountainous and so on. So we have a good representation of the country as a whole. So, and in the paper, first paper that I wrote, I provide a lot of narrative, a lot of details of how the school were created to show that it has sometimes, location has something to do with chance. I don't have time to go through the details, but the missionary roots, they went to the place to set up the school without thinking where the school is going to be created, and this map is an illustration of that. Now, what is interesting is the way we selected the control location, because we know where the school was, but then we have to find other places that could have schools, but did not. So what we did is the following. So for instance, take this location, is Zainado. So we made 7 kilometers radius around the school and consider the interior of a circle as the treatment area. Now, from 7 kilometers to 20 kilometers, there is a band where if you live in a village in that band, you are too far from the school, but you are not too far away from the school. Too far, not too close, because, you are too far because, 7 kilometers for the kids to go to school is too much. But 20 kilometers, because I want a village which will look like the one where the school was created. So within that band, we made the list of all the schools and randomly picked 2 of them. As if it was an exercise that the missionaries did when they set up the school in late 19th century. So that's how the site was selected. Now, let's talk about the students, because we wanted to see the effect of education. The effect of education. Education here means 2 things. It means you have a school in your village, or you have a school in your village, or you have been educated. Because you might have people who live near school, but were not selected to go to school. You see what I mean? So we have 3 groups. We have a first group of people who live in a village with school, but who have not been selected among the first 2 cohorts who have been to school. And then we have people who have been selected, and then there are people living in the control place that I just described earlier. So what we did is, we went to the archives to get the names of all the kids from those schools. It took us about a year to be able to get the complete list of the kids who were selected, all right? So in the first 2 cohorts. Now, interestingly, we need to find people in the village who could have been to school but were not selected, but there's no census. So how do we find them? We did something called backward sampling. So we went to a village and randomly selected 40 people, above 40, whose grandparents may have been among those who could have been to the school, but were not. And we get their names. They give us the name of their parents. And then when we get the name of the parents, we went to the cemetery to get their date of birth to make sure that they are from the same generation as those who have been to school. So that's how we have the list of people from the second group. Living near school, no education. And now we did exactly the same exercise in the control place. So as a result, we were able to not only see how, from the life of those who were educated, how they potentially influence those near them, and then we can compare them to those living 7 kilometers away, no school, no education, okay? So now, second generation, because as I said, what we want to see how education not only spread geographically, but also spread, from one generation to another. So what we did after that was we have a list. Since we have a list of everyone from each group, we have a list of all their kids, and then we sample 10 of those kids when they have less than 10. Sorry, we take the list of all the kids if it's less than 10, and when they are more than 10, we sample them. And then we did an interview. So we have not only a complete list of the people, but also of their descendants. Oh yes, I forgot to mention that since we are talking about African families, we also need to find out the niece and nephews. So we get the list of all the brothers and sisters, all their kids, and sample them, okay? So the descendants are not only the kids of those who have been to school, but also their nephews and nieces, okay? So it was a very time-consuming exercise. Since we are talking about oral history here, we need to make sure that the data is reliable. So the way we made it reliable is that every interview that we provide, we ask the respondent to provide physical evidence. Like for instance, birth certificate, ID, and so on. Or if it's not possible, then we have to interview at least 2 or 3 people. If they all say the same thing, then the information is correct, or more or less correct. If it's not, then we put some weight on it. We make sure that the information we get is reliable. So that's how the data was collected. Those are pictures, for instance, of those who set up the school in my village. Anyway, so first thing, as you can see, first thing, those who've been to school, big effect on occupational choice, on income, education level, okay? Living standards higher, and so this is a picture of somebody who had been to school, a picture of a family with no school, and housing of somebody who had been to school. Even then, I would love to have a house like this, in Benin. So that's a picture of somebody been to school, a picture of somebody who living in a village with school. That's what it looked like, a picture of somebody who had not been to school. So you can see from the housing quality, the difference in income. Now, okay. Now, we also find big effect on second generation. So huge social mobility. But then the most remarkable mobility is those living who did not go to school first generation, living near somebody who had been to school, first generation. So the gap that you saw has shrunk completely. So for instance, if you look at this regression table, you see the village treatment effect is very big. Meaning, so it's important to understand when you want to study mobility and development to see how neighbors, how people live close to each other influence, incentives to make choices that have big effect on development. And that's the story of the PhD mothers that I was talking about. Illiterate, never been to school, it was in the 50s and 60s or some of them, but, they produce, people like me. So, and it's because they have the example, they were aspiration stories, okay? So, so this is second generation, higher health, higher wealth, stronger social ties, and then you see, for instance, big family externalities. For instance, no difference between the kids of those who were educated and their nephew and nieces. No difference in terms of education outcome, wealth, and so on. So within the family, you have complete transmission of wealth and education opportunities. Now, you see some little difference between family members and those living near the family, which shows that there is still a value of being a family member of somebody who is educated. Now, so this picture shows what I call family tax. It shows how much transfer an educated member of a family is making to his nephew and nieces, And the evidence shows that, interestingly, the wealthier you are, the more children your brothers and sisters have, So they anticipate that, well, somebody's going to take care of those kids and have as many as they want. So, I mentioned the story of aspiration, which is critical. It's a critical part of the story. And the way we show the aspiration story in particular is, for instance, to do the following exercise. So you take the school is here, and then you take villages that are equidistant from the school, and then one of the village has no one who have been to school, and this village has one individual who have been to school. And you see a huge difference in outcome. So it's not enough to be close to the school. You have to have someone in the family family in the village who have been to school to serve as an aspiration for everyone else. Now, we also find entrepreneurship help. So given the pressure that the educated welfare has, when they have a shop, they tend to be able to help people from their family and their neighbors much more, So now, so let me now go to the third generation. The third generation, we find, for instance, that, this is very much work in progress. What you find is that, in the middle is treatment 1, that's the village, and treatment 0 is the control. You can see on the yellow line that, we divide people from the third generation into 2 groups, lower class, middle class, upper class. You can see, for instance, that there are more people upper class in treatment than in control. Almost like only 1 in control and 42 in treatment. And then what is interesting, even when you consider the demographics, the fact that, people with little, lower class people contributed greatly to having upper class kids. You can see 1 is the lowest. They have, in the data, they have 16 or 14 people from in the lower class. The middle class have 13, the upper class have 14. And the percentage is 35, and 30. So, again, we are going to do a rigorous empirical analysis, but what is interesting here is to show how balanced the contribution is over the 3 generations in terms of moving up. You have, it's as if there is an equalization of opportunities, I should say, between different income brackets. But again, this is driven here by family tax, not by this. I think this likely is driven by family tax, not by government taxation. But what is also stunning is to see the contribution of the wealthy, people whose parents were 3, to those, how many 1 the parents who were 3 has created. You see what I mean? Like, there are many kids who went downhill despite the fact that their parents were upper class. If you go to African cities, this is a reality. For instance, I have, actually, this is one of the motivations for me to start this study, because I have a couple of uncles who were the big stars in the 60s, very upper class. They have 12, 15 kids each. 1 made it, the other 14 or 12 are just completely lost. Obviously, some will blame on people like me who were also getting some income from them, but on top of it, I think it's a very interesting dynamics to study. Why this decline? Why this huge decline of the people from upper or middle class in Africa in the 60s? That's very interesting, and you can see along, all along, people from control have worse income than people in treatment. It shows that education is still great. Now, the next is, and this is the most, I'm obsessed about trying to understand what lack of mobility does to people, because it's something that we don't study enough. We are obsessed about whether there is land of opportunity or not, where we are land of opportunity, but what happens when we are not? So what happens? So what we did is that it should be financial risk aversion. So we have measures of financial risk aversion, self-reliance, and mental health, a battery of questions to capture these things. And we find that mobility helps financial risk aversion and self-reliance. Okay? So it shows that those who are moving up are willing to take more financial risk. So that's interesting. Now, okay, in terms of pessimism, there are questions about pessimism that we ask. What do you think about, what's your outlook about life and so on? You see, what is amazing is, for instance, one is the lower class. They are less and less pessimistic when their outcome goes up. Like, for instance, you see when somebody who is even dirt poor, whose grandparents were dirt poor and parents were poor, but they are moving up, they are more optimistic. So which in fact, corroborate what I said earlier, which is it's not just where you are, it's where it's where you are coming from. And as a result, you can see, for instance, that people whose parents were rich, like 5, moving down. In terms of I think the evidence suggests that they are more pessimistic, but it's not it's not big. But it's something that we are going to study. Mental health, there are a bunch of questions about how often do you sleep, how well do you sleep, and are you, some kind of depression-related questions. And you find, for instance, the evidence suggests that, for instance, those who are moving up tend to be in a more and more better mental health. And that's could be a very, very important result, especially even in the context of the US. So basically the story here is that I think as a development economist we should study mobility more. And I know it's difficult, but something needs to be done, because it just puts more responsibility in the hands of family individuals in process of development. It's also helpful to understand how we can design policy to help families, not only to give them stuff, but to give them incentives so that they take care of themselves. And this is something extremely important. And then another thing here is to put the issue of social mobility not only as something that we should study for its own sake, to see whether we are moving up or not, but to see how lack of mobility, for instance, can affect individuals. For instance, there was a study done in France showing, for instance, that many of the right-wing voters voted for the extreme right-wing political party because they were fearful of downward mobility. And you can understand that, because when you are fearing to lose your privilege, then you see the immigrant, you see people who are moving up in a different light. And so it's very, very important to sort of see how mobility affects people, not only the way they vote, but others, but also but also, for instance, their attitude towards risk. We also have some stuff on attitude, time preference. Are they more impatient? Because the idea is that whenever you are poor, you want to do everything now. You have no time, you have no discount rate, whatever it is. But in fact, this is not true. It depends, it's only partly true. It depends on where you come from as well. For instance, you are going to be optimistic even if you have been moving up, even if it's slightly, as opposed to you might be more pessimistic if you are moving down. And there is so much moving down today that we should pay more attention, And then for all of us who have made it, so it put pressure on us to make sure that their kids do as well as us, because I don't know, as a PhD and professor at Princeton, I don't know what I'm going to do to get my kids to be, anyway, so maybe the solution would be to get him to value things other than being a professor at Princeton, so that at least he will say, well, I'm not a professor at Princeton, but I love jazz. Loving jazz is equally important than being a professor at Princeton. Anyway, maybe those exercises, maybe. Anyway, so more seriously, thanks so much for your attention, and we're looking for your questions. Yeah.
This was fascinating. Thanks a lot. So 3 things. Personally, I would not call the effect of having somebody in the village necessarily a human capital externality. I mean, as an economist, when I think of a human capital externality, it's the pure effect of your human capital on my productivity, not necessarily your inspiration for me to invest in my own human capital, which could be the channel. And Darona Jamolo has this review last year in the annual reviews of economics where he says, look, the evidence we have is not compatible with, quote, human capital externalities of any significant magnitude, unquote. He's not saying that Rob Jensen's QJE paper is wrong, that you can go around Dominican Republic inspiring people to get more school by giving them the example of how much money you can make, et cetera. He's talking about a direct productivity effect. And this may or may not be a human capital externality. Two, I'm sure you know the work of Felipe Valencia, who is at University of Bonn. He has this fascinating paper called The Mission, where he traces the long-term effects of Jesuit schools in Paraguay. And one of the most fascinating aspects of that paper is he has concern about endogenous school placement, and he shows that this effect doesn't arise in places where they started schools but then closed them. And I wonder if we should be worried about a selective placement of the schools in your case. And then lastly, should we be worried about attrition? I sympathize with the use of the retrospective data. It's a fascinating use of retrospective data, but is there anything about schooling that could make people move to, I don't know, be a Princeton professor and not be present for the, so that their descendants are not present for the survey, or even die? Other forms of attrition we could imagine, so that part of treatment or control is not around, especially after multiple generations, to answer the survey.
Regarding your point, the first point well taken, regarding the question about exogeneity, so we went in the great length to show through balanced tests and other tests that treatment and control are very similar. But also, we sort of use a lot of sensitivity analysis to show that the effect we find to go away, like the endogeneity introduced by selection has to be huge, So we did that test, but we also focus on only the first two generations, and we gave a lot of stories to show that in fact those who have among the first who have been educated. Actually, if anything, you have a lot of negative selection because people were so scared or so mistrusted the missionaries so much that they only send the weak kids, So we have all those stories to show that. So, but again, I mean that's how we dealt with endogeneity in the paper. Now regarding attrition, so we were very patient. So your IBUI, I mean, the only place you could be without us finding you is the moon. I mean, if you are in Paris, we'll interview. So anyway, we trace people as much as we can, and but again, we did a lot of tests, missing, recall bias, and all this kind of stuff to show that for the result to go away, and we even trim the worst case, the best case scenario, whatever, to show that. Even if this were the case, the result will still remain, So anyway, I think we did the best we could to deal with those kind of issues.
Do you have a sense of the attitude of people who lived in villages without educated members? What their attitudes were towards villages that did have educated members? Was it aspirational or jealousy or some combination of whatever? And bringing that today, what are how high on the list of priorities is education for people who don't have it, as opposed to, other factors like, let's say, clean water or access to, healthcare or whatever it is. I mean, like what do people there want, as opposed to what as opposed to what we can do for them? What do they want from us?
No, I think that's it. Let me start with the second question. So one of the things that I realized from this paper is that when we talk about education policy, there is too much focus on supply, not enough on demand. So what drives these PhD mothers? They were crazy about education. They were doing whatever it took. I mean, I have a a long list of motivation tactics that my mother in particular were using to make sure that I stay where I'm supposed to be, you know? And that's really important. And I mean, I heard similar stories in Western Nigeria. You know, for instance, when the mission came and set up school in late 19th century, I mean, like, after the missionary died, they went door to door to get money to build a new school, you know? And this was the impulse that led, for instance, to Awolowo to select, I mean, to create schools, I mean, to get free primary education policy in late 50s. So like, not only I only talk about personal story, but also community engagement. You know, like if you don't go to school, anybody in the village is after you, you know. And there are rituals that people use to get kids be in harmony with where they live, you know. And then we were taught the local culture, many things that help us to be very mature, even when we were very, very young. So I think one thing is to sort of train teachers to build new schools. Another thing is to sort of recreate this enthusiasm, this drive for education in those communities. That explains why we have this big boost in education outcome in the 50s and 60s. You know. So that's one important point. That so education policy has to be incentivizing to have high demand for education. You know. And second point, you know, about whether those people were too far. You know, I mean, we selected places that were too far from the location of the school, so they were lucky enough to experience it. But then you have a lot of stories where they intermarry, you know, they meet at the market and so on. So that's why even between treatment and control, you have some catch-up going on. But again, you know, the story, at least in the region where I come from, is you can have 93% primary enrollment rate in one place. You go 20 kilometers after, it's 10%. You know, I mean, it's just huge difference. But then it's networks, it's aspiration, and so on. So it, you know, one policy recommendation would be to sort of obviously build more schools, but also prevent as much as possible isolation by providing more infrastructure to get people to meet and to interact and so on. Because you see from the result of this how interaction can in fact inspire people to do much better.
Sorry, just have one question about your third generation effect.
Yeah.
It strikes me that the relative difference between the first and the fifth quintile doesn't change, but the absolute difference in recent decades has grown substantially. Yeah. So that folks at the lowest level may just plain be more depressed because they are still making the same amount of money as their grandparents, and so folks at the higher level are, of course, joining this global elite. So that would be just a time-based question about your study.
Yeah. So I mean, the third generation result is very, very new. I didn't have time to digest it well enough to give you a complete answer with something I need to think about. But what I find here, for instance, in terms of pessimism, is that, you know, whatever happens to you compared to where your parents were, it doesn't make a big difference, at least in this table. But again, it's very descriptive. But then, when you are low, by moving up, you are becoming less and less pessimistic. You know, so now, okay. But again, I can see how robust this is and measure perhaps things in a different way. But
Leonard, can
yes.
you just say what these numbers mean? In which direction?
Oh, yeah.
Is more
okay.
pessimism?
No. I mean, there's a battery of questions. There is a battery.
Which differences are statistically significant, and so on?
Yeah. Exactly. So this is what you have in parentheses, just chi-squares test. And but again, this is very descriptive statistics. You know, we haven't done any serious regression as of yet. You know, but the final version of the paper will have a more detailed analysis of this. But the way pessimism measured is, you know, the usual mental health kind of questions, and say, you know, how often help you to be, how happens, I mean, your outlook on life in general, maybe some trust questions, and, you know, I will put online the questionnaire. So for that, so that people have
a higher number means more pessimism or less?
Yes, here, yeah, exactly.
A higher number means more pessimism.
Exactly, because most of the time, actually, I went to interview these people, so I know how I was very surprised to see how even slight mobility affects upward mobility affects people's outlook on life, and how decline, regardless where you are, also affect people's life. So anyway, there is a sense that this is what's going on, but again, we need to do something more robust and explain where the number come from, the questionnaire in details, so that you have a good sense of what's happening. Yes.
Hi, my question is more about, because we talk about education in these broad generalities and not the type of education, and you referred in your talk to the third generation somewhat experiencing a decline of some level, and you describe it as a mystery, and I'm curious, because if you look at most colonial education types across the continent, they were more of an administrative nature. They weren't educations that equip people to be productive.
Exactly.
So I'm curious how you place that thinking along with what we see in terms of incomes not increasing as much as they should, and if you juxtapose that with what you see happening in East Asia and so forth, because I'm from Nigeria, you're from Benin, we're next door to each other, and we have all these people coming out from schools, they're quote unquote educated, but in terms of their productive ability and them being able to sort of move their countries from where they are in an extractive state to what one could describe as a productive state, we're not seeing that happening. And I'm somewhat curious as to how you'd respond to that in terms of your overall talk.
Absolutely. So I think this is a very important question. So we have to be two things. We have to be very careful about, we have the occupation of all those who were educated, and most of them were civil servants. And one of the very primary results is to find that mobility, for instance, doesn't affect work ethics. Actually, for instance, it's the case that the educated perhaps have less work ethics than the one who was slightly less educated. You see what I mean? So, for instance, that's again preliminary, but it might be going into your direction. That the type of education, the type of job that education led to might have made people not as productive. That's one. But also because government jobs are shrinking, you have a lot of highly educated people who are unemployed. So that could be another reason. Or for instance, it could be migration. Like for instance, the highly successful of the family has left, and there are very few of them, and the rest stay behind and get the government jobs. So that might be also what's going on. It could also be psychological in the sense that those people who are rich when young were relying too much on their parents' wealth when they get old. So I think the decline, this even slight decline among the upper class is something that really needs like in-depth, study. And I totally agree with you. Now, we have to be very careful also when we talk about colonial education, because one of the things that I realize is, okay, we are going to schools, mission school. When we get home, we still have our parents to tell us stories about the village, to tell us stories about the history of the place where we come from. We are still learning our local languages. So because the community embraced education in general, so we were in a way combining like the endogenous education in an informal way with formal education. So it's something that we have to keep in mind when we are teaching their kids today, because when I go to Benin, for instance, I have young people who are preventing their kids to speak the local language because they think that not speaking the local language will get you ahead, because you can speak the French accent with Parisian accent and so on. So anyway, so colonial school, we have to be very nuanced in how we characterize it. Anyway, so I agree with you entirely on that.